There is a truth that most people who step out of a narcissistic relationship only understand once they stand on the far shore of their pain. It is your silence that truly begins to reverse the entire power they once held. Throughout the relationship, they survived on your reactions, whether it was your tears, your explanations, your anger, or your despair. To them, your emotions were fuel, and every time you tried to explain, fix, or prove your innocence, you unintentionally reinforced the image they needed to sustain the illusion of their own grandiose self. But when the discard happens, when they actively leave, deny you, replace you, or make you believe you no longer matter, they still believe the outcome is in their hands. That is the greatest delusion they have ever carried, that you will collapse exactly according to the script they wrote. They never consider what happens when you choose the one thing they cannot control: silence. Silence is not a sign of defeat. It is the end of an invisible form of dependency. When you become silent, you withdraw the greatest power they ever seized, the ability to define your emotions, your reactions, and your worth. Jung once said that the shadow only holds power when we cannot see it. And when you are silent, when you do not react, do not resist, do not chase, you unintentionally force them to face the very shadow they have been running from all their lives. They no longer have a place to unload their inner emptiness, no mirror to sustain the illusion of their importance, no soft soul to cling to when the fear of being forgotten arises. Your silence becomes a space they cannot enter, cannot manipulate, cannot perform in, and cannot rewrite. And within that space, they must confront the most painful truth. They never had as much power as they believed. What they lose is not you, it is the version of you that used to meet their needs. And what terrifies them is not your absence, it is the collapse of the psychological structure they used you to maintain. Your silence is not merely the end of a relationship, it is the birth of a new self. A self that no longer participates in the role others design, no longer serves as a container for someone else's shadow, and no longer lives within energy boundaries imposed by someone else. That is the deeper reason why your silence after being discarded becomes a fatal blow to them, not because of what you do, but because you stop doing what they believed you could never stop. Part 1. The illusion of victory inside the narcissist's mind. When a narcissist performs a discard, they are not merely leaving a relationship. They are reenacting a psychological ritual they believe proves their absolute power. In their mental framework, discarding you is not an ending, but an act of ego affirmation. A declaration that they can define your worth, manipulate your emotions, and control the story however they wish. This is not just an ordinary emotional reaction, it is the consequence of a specific psychological structure that Otto Kernberg, one of the greatest psychoanalysts of the 20th century, describes as identity diffusion. They do not possess a stable sense of self, so they must constantly seek self-description through the emotional destabilization of others. In their eyes, the discard is the ultimate tool to do exactly that. In the script they write, you must suffer, you must collapse, you must search for them, you must react. When you react, you unconsciously send them a message. You are still the center of my emotional universe. That is the fuel they are addicted to. Research by Dr. Craig Malkin, a Harvard psychologist and expert on narcissistic disorders, shows that narcissists use reactive supply as the energy source that sustains their sense of power. This means they do not care how you feel, they only care whether you react. Reaction equals they exist. No reaction equals their ego begins to crack. And because they live on reactions, they believe the discard will create the chaos they are familiar with. You panicking, demanding explanations, clinging to them, desperately seeking closure. All those reactions reinforce the role they assign to you in their inner fantasy, the weaker one, the dependent one, the easily controlled one. That is why they confidently view the discard as a mark of victory. They believe you will continue revolving around them like a planet around the sun. But this is the greatest blind spot in their psychological architecture. As John Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, explained, those who grow up with avoidant, or early injured attachment patterns maintain the illusion that they do not need others, but in truth, they are governed by a deep fear of abandonment. For narcissists, the discard is their way of abandoning before being abandoned, used to avoid confronting their own feelings of vulnerability. They believe that by leaving first, they will never have to feel weak. However, they forget one thing. Behavior creates the illusion of control, but it does not create inner stability. That is why they must constantly monitor you after the discard. Are you posting anything online? Are you crying? Are you trying to reach out? Do you seem hurt? Every tiny action of yours is interpreted through the logic of their ego. If you're hurting, they are right. If you chase, they are powerful. If you react, they are still controlling the story. Research by psychologist Sam Vaknin also emphasizes that narcissists cannot distinguish their own existence from other people's reactions, meaning they only feel real when you react to them. Therefore, in their mind, when they discard you, you must collapse. If you don't, their entire ego structure is threatened. That is why they cannot imagine a scenario where you stay silent. No texting, no chasing, no seeking closure, no sign that they still affect you. Because when you no longer revolve around them, they do not merely lose a relationship, they lose a source of self-definition. And what they lose is not you. It is their ability to use you to prevent their ego from collapsing. From that moment on, the mask of victory begins to crack, and the downfall will come faster than they ever expected. Part 2. Why your silence becomes the fatal blow. Your silence becomes the fatal blow not because it hurts them emotionally, the way it would hurt a normal person, but because it strikes directly at the psychological foundation their ego depends on to survive. When you are silent, you are not just cutting off emotional supply, you are forcing them to face the inner void they have spent their entire life running from. Carl Jung described this void as the hungry shadow, a part of the psyche that is always starved for validation and can only be temporarily soothed when someone else reflects it back. When you are silent, that shadow has nothing left to cling to, and it begins to turn inward, consuming them from within. This is why your silence creates the initial panic. They lose the ability to predict you. In Dr. Paul Rosenberg's research on uncertainty intolerance in individuals with narcissistic traits, he explains that what terrifies them is not the truth itself, but the inability to control the emotional responses of the other person. Not knowing what you think, not knowing what you feel, not knowing whether you are still hurting or already standing up again. All of this becomes a threat to them, and the less they know, the more catastrophic the internal scenarios they must create to fill that void. Your silence strips them of their ability to interpret reality in a way that benefits their ego. In other words, they lose the power to rewrite the narrative. And when the narrative no longer revolves around them, their ego loses its axis of rotation. Next, your silence strikes at what Freud called a narcissistic injury, a wound to the ego that occurs when they do not receive the response they believe they deserve. But while Freud described it as a stab to their self-esteem, modern researchers like Dr. Ramani Durvasula expand this further. Narcissists experience silence as a psychic annihilation, a psychological erasure. They do not simply feel sad, they feel non-existent. The reason is that their existence, in Jung's language, depends on persona inflation, a swollen veneer of identity that can only be maintained when someone is watching, reacting, and affirming it. When you are silent, you remove the light that once sustained that persona. No light, no reflection, no persona, only the raw shadow of who they really are. This explains why your silence terrifies them to the point of losing control. They are not only losing you, they are losing the version of themselves that existed through your eyes. In the therapeutic model of Dr. Heinz Koht, the founder of self-psychology, he describes how individuals with narcissistic structures cannot self-regulate emotionally. They can only stabilize internally when someone else reflects their value back to them. When you are silent, they fall into a state of self-fragmentation. The self begins to crack, They do not know who they are, they do not know where their value lies, and they do not know how to feel stable without someone to mirror them. That is why your silence destabilizes them so profoundly. It cuts off their self-regulation mechanism and drops them into the emptiness they always feared confronting. And the final factor that makes your silence a fatal blow is the loss of symbolic power. In the narcissist's mind, they survive by maintaining the illusion that they are important, superior, and always impactful to others. When you are silent, you shatter that illusion. Research by psychologist W. Keith Campbell shows that narcissists perceive attention as life energy. When they are no longer observed, they feel existentially threatened. Therefore, your silence is not simply a lack of response, it is a denial of power. It is not that you are silent, it is that you revoke their central role in your world. As a result, your silence breaks all four pillars of their ego at once: loss of control, loss of emotional power, loss of the reflective mirror, and loss of the central role. This is no longer discomfort. This is an existential collapse. And from this point, the spiral of panic, rage, and eventual disintegration begins, all because you did the one thing they never believed you could do. You stopped reacting. Part 3. The wave of panic and rage when the shadow rises. When your silence continues, the narcissist enters the stage that Jung described as the uprising of the shadow. This is not ordinary anger. This is an internal rebellion where the part of them they have always hidden is forced to surface into consciousness. The first wave of panic appears when they realize your silence is not a strategy but a new reality. You are no longer revolving around them, no longer reflecting them, no longer playing the role they assign to you. This awakens their primal fear, the fear of non-existence. Jung wrote that the shadow always emerges when external light disappears. That light used to be your feedback. Now that it is gone, the shadow swells inside them like a starved creature demanding to be seen. At this stage, they feel as if they are losing the version of themselves they believed they were. The persona, the polished mask they used to manipulate and control, begins to crack because it no longer receives the external energy that sustained it. And as the persona weakens, the shadow steps forward to take center stage. This is when panic transforms into anger. Their anger is not directed at you, but at the invisible void your silence has created. Yet because they cannot take responsibility for their emotions, they must project them outward, and you become the clearest target. They are angry because you aren't playing the role they need. Angry because you aren't hurting the way they expected. Angry because you did the one thing they didn't think you could do: escape their orbit. This anger is not a behavior, it is the collapse of the ego's structure. In Jungian terms, anger is the signal that the ego is losing control to the shadow. When the shadow rises, it brings all the parts they have denied: insecurity, emptiness, fear of being forgotten, the deep smallness they never dared face. But because they cannot confront these parts, they must assign you the blame. They must say you are the one causing these feelings. This is a stage where they begin texting unpredictably, hinting, probing, stalking you online, or even spreading rumors just to see if you will react. They do not care what is true. They only care whether they still hold weight in your inner world. And if you remain silent, the anger shifts into a deeper form of panic, the state Jung described as archetypal unrest, the feeling of being stripped from the identity role they once controlled through manipulation. In this state, they feel like a character without a stage. And this is the narcissist's most painful ego wound. They have not only lost power, they have lost the story they lived inside. They begin to realize you are no longer a character in their script. And when the script loses its power, their ego shakes like a system without gravity. Then fear and anger merge into a vortex that pushes them to pull you back onto the stage through hoovering, indirect contact, nostalgia triggers, or chaos designed to test whether you will react. But in the Jungian view, the real transformation is not in their behavior, it is in the truth that their shadow has lost its hiding place. And you, through silence, have become the mirror that forces them to see themselves. That is why their rage is so intense. They are not angry at you. They are angry at the part of themselves they can no longer control. Part 4. The inner disintegration phase. The collapse of the persona. When panic and rage fail to produce the reaction they expected, the narcissist enters the phase that, in Jung's language, can be called the collapse of the persona. The moment when the mask they built from illusions of power begins to cave in on them. This is the stage where your silence is no longer just silence. It becomes a destructuring force inside them, peeling away each layer of the false ego they so carefully constructed to hide their primal emptiness. At the deepest level of the psyche, persona and shadow maintain a fragile balance, and the persona can only stand as long as there is enough light from the outside, the light of attention, feedback, and reflection from others. When you are silent, that light disappears, and the persona is left without the energetic support it needs to exist. The result is that the shadow swells, takes over, and floods their consciousness like a tidal wave they cannot control. This is the true disintegration phase. They feel insecure for no clear reason, empty without explanation, anxious without knowing exactly what they are anxious about. Inside them, the ego begins to crack, because no one is affirming it anymore, and in that gap the images they once used you to escape from, buried memories, shame, imperfection, smallness, rise up all at once. Jung called this state psyche in disintegration. This is what most people would call a terrible loneliness, but for the narcissist it is worse. It is the realization that they can no longer hide inside someone else. When the persona collapses, the shadow demands to rule. But the narcissist's shadow is not a part seeking healing. It is a part inflated by long-standing fear and denial. So when it surges upward, it does not come with honesty or self-awareness, but with chaos. They feel exposed, they feel hollowed out, as if all their energy has been drained. They feel as if nothing has meaning anymore, as though no one can see them. This is the stage where many narcissists begin to experience inner depletion, an internal exhaustion they cannot describe, yet feel clearly as a spreading darkness. They try to reconstruct the old mask, polishing their image, chasing attention from others, jumping into new relationships, bragging, exaggerating, performing. But every attempt has a hole in it. It does not come from real confidence, but from the fear of being swallowed by the shadow within. And without you, the one who used to stabilize their inner world with your reactions, your emotions, your presence, they cannot rebuild the system. This is when they begin to feel as though they are falling into a bottomless void. Not because they lost you, but because they lost the sense of I am the center that you once unconsciously supplied. This moment is very close to what Jung describes as ego death in shadow confrontation. A kind of death of the old self, when nothing is left to hold it up. But unlike the healing journey, where disintegration makes way for light, their disintegration only leads to a darker layer, because they lack the courage to look at their shadow with honesty. They fight it, they deny it, they twist reality to avoid it, but the shadow does not disappear. It clings, expands, and devours every weak spot they cannot defend. This is when they begin to feel lost to themselves. Many narcissists describe this phase as if they are standing outside their own body, watching themselves from a distance, uncertain who they are. They feel helpless, irritable, easily triggered, or suddenly sink into heaviness. They may sleep more than usual, or be unable to sleep even when exhausted. They seek distraction, throw themselves into pleasures or new connections, but everything only highlights one truth. No one can fill the gap you once unknowingly filled with your empathy. And within this disintegration, a truth they never wanted to admit begins to emerge. They realize you are no longer under their control. Your silence has not just taken away a person, it has taken away the structure their ego depended on. And in the internal world of a narcissist, that is the harshest punishment. Part 5. The deep reasons they come back. When the inner disintegration reaches a point they can no longer control, the narcissist begins to feel an urgent need they often mistake for missing you, loving you, or regretting what they did. But from a Jungian perspective, this is not love. This is the reaction of an ego desperately trying to recover a structure it has lost. They come back not for you, but for the version of themselves that existed next to you. You were once the mirror. When the mirror disappears, they must return to the only place they know once reflected them in the most flattering way. This is the first deep reason. They need you as a tool to restore the persona. Their persona, the powerful mask they use to face the world, has been eroded by your silence. Coming back to you, even through a short message, a casual question, or a half-hearted apology, is their way of testing whether the mask can be rebuilt through your response. The second reason, the distortion of the shadow. Jung said that when the shadow is not integrated, it goes looking for an external host to latch onto. You used to be that host. You were not only the person they manipulated, you were the one they deposited their shadow into. When you are silent, you no longer carry that shadow, and it turns back to tear them apart. Returning to you is their attempt to hand back the shadow, to force you to hold it again so they can feel lighter. They cannot bear its weight alone. They come back, not because of you, but because they want to unload a psychological burden they are unable to contain. The third reason, the archetype of the starving predator. When you stop reacting, they no longer feel powerful. They return out of primitive instinct, like a creature cut off from its food source. They do not know how to generate inner energy, so they must go back to the place that once supplied it. On a Jungian level, this reflects the failure of the functional ego, a self not mature enough to sustain itself. You once acted as a survival energy source for them. Hoovering is the instinctive search for that source. The fourth reason, they are afraid your silence is creating a new version of you, a version they cannot control. In their inner world, your transformation is a threat. If you grow stronger, they become weaker. If you are at peace, they feel more unstable. If you move on, their role in your life disappears. Coming back is their attempt to freeze you in your old version, so they can comfortably exist in the same old script. The fifth reason, the failure of power replacement. After trying to use others as replacement supply, they encounter a frightening realization: the new supply does not produce the same effect you once did. Because you are not an ordinary person, you are an empath. Jung called souls like yours carriers of psychic light, bearers of inner light. That light once soothed their shadow for a while. When the new person does not have that light, they feel deprived, hollow, as if every attempt at replacement fails. So they return, not to receive your light with reverence, but to drain it one more time. The sixth reason, they want to test whether they still have power. Hoovering is not a love confession, it is an exam. They come close to see if you still shake, still hurt, still respond. A single signal from you can make their ego feel restored. If you react, positively or negatively, they win. If you stay silent, they fall back into fragmentation. Hoovering is their last attempt to determine whether they still exist in your mind. The final reason, and the one a narcissist will never admit, they come back because they sense a truth they have spent their whole life running from. You were the only one who ever truly saw them and did not immediately flee. The only one who once reached the human part hidden behind their arrogant mask. Your silence makes them feel that even that human part is slipping away, and they fear that more than anything. Hoovering is not love. It is the sign of a dying ego trying to crawl back into its old ecosystem. Part 6. Why they approach you or disappear completely. When a narcissist encounters you after being pushed out of your emotional orbit for a long time, their reaction will fall into one of two extremes. Either they move toward you as if pulled by an invisible force, or they avoid you as if you are a threat. And what determines this reaction is not emotion or logic. It is the internal battle between the persona and the shadow erupting inside them the moment their eyes meet yours. If the persona wins, they approach. If the shadow wins, they disappear. On a deeper level, people often assume they approach because they still have feelings for you. But in the Jungian perspective, approach happens only when they sense that you might still be the old source of supply. When they see you, they scan not with their eyes, but with their energy field. Are you still weak, still trembling, is still emotionally reactive? Is your gaze still influenced by them? If they detect even the smallest trace of softness, uncertainty, or vulnerability, the persona rises instantly to reclaim center stage. The persona whispers, I can manipulate this again, I can absorb this light again. And they walk toward you, wearing a warm smile, a gentle voice, or a caring demeanor that is nothing more than calculated performance. Approaching is not about reconnecting, it is an attempt to restore lost power. But if, in the moment they see you, you do not flinch, do not look away, do not tremble, if your energy does not shrink but remains steady, their shadow immediately overwhelms the persona. The reason is simple. The shadow recognizes what the persona desperately tries to hide. You no longer belong to the old role. The shadow understands that you are looking through them, not at the version they built. And in the depths of the narcissist's psyche, nothing is more terrifying than being truly seen. When they realize you are no longer the container for their fears, their shadow becomes unstable. The shadow whispers, stay away, they see you, they know you're fake. And when the shadow wins, they avoid you instantly. They lower their gaze, turn away, look at something else, pretend to be busy or even leave abruptly. This avoidance is not contempt, as many assume. It is self-protection. They are terrified of your gaze because your gaze no longer reflects the version of themselves they want to believe in. Instead, it reflects the part they hate most within themselves. In Jungian analysis, meeting someone who once served as a mirror architect is always a confrontation between the false self and the shadow. For ordinary people, this creates a chance for healing. For narcissists, it is a threat. They know you once saw the part they hide beneath the persona, and now, as you stand before them calm, neutral, unfazed, no longer collapsing your energy, they perceive you as a mirror. Their shadow cannot endure. Their shadow fears you because you no longer provide engagement energy. You do not react. You do not absorb. You do not allow them into your emotional field. This makes them feel as if they are standing before a closed door, one they cannot enter, control, or influence. Approaching or disappearing are simply two expressions of the same truth. They have lost power. If they approach, it is an attempt to reclaim it. If they avoid you, it is an admission that the power is gone forever. And in both cases, their reaction revolves around one thing. They no longer control the narrative. What they see when they look at you is not who you are. It is the abyss they are falling into, an abyss created by your silence and your withdrawal from the psychological game they once imposed on you. In the end, what this encounter teaches you is not how to identify a narcissist or how to resist them. It teaches you how to see yourself after everything they once tried to obscure. The silence you chose did not only destroy their power, it revealed your true nature, a soul no longer governed by fear, attachment, or the need to prove anything to anyone. When you stand before them without trembling, without orbiting around them, without needing their understanding or acknowledgement, you step into a form of freedom Jung called the separation of the soul from another's shadow. It is a liberation no one can give you and no one can take from you. The narcissist never imagined that your silence could collapse them so deeply. But the truth is, they are not collapsing because of you. They are collapsing because, for the first time, they are seeing the emptiness inside themselves without anyone left to blame. The shadow they once used you to carry has returned to them fully, and now they must face it alone. And that is what they cannot bear. As for you, silence is not a weapon, it is a doorway. You did not choose silence to punish them. You chose it to finally walk out of their life without carrying any of their darkness with you. You did not seek revenge. You did not win in the way they define winning. You simply returned to yourself, but to a wiser, clearer, more sovereign version. And the most beautiful part? They can never follow you here. They may try to return, to reach you, to test whether you still react, but you have crossed into a new reality, one where they no longer have a role, a shape, or a language to pull you back into the old game. You have become someone they cannot manipulate, cannot hold, and cannot define. In the end, you did not destroy them with silence. You simply left them alone with what was always inside them. And you walk away with a peace they will never have the capacity to reach.